Second International Brass Congress took place at Indiana University in June 1984. It was my privilege to help schedule the various events during the week, and I would like to share with you one especially significant moment. Arnold Jacobs, the tuba player for over 40 years with the famous brass section of the Chicago Symphony Orchestra and teacher of countless professional brass instrumentalists around the world, was the honored guest of the Second International Brass Congress. During one of the infrequent lulls in the proceedings, many of Arnold Jacobs' students, covering 50 years of teaching, gathered with him in an informal discussion of the many facets of musical performance that have been researched and so successfully applied by this great master. The students themselves included many of the world's most distinguished performers, which would appear to be a very strong indication of Arnold Jacobs' pedagogical skills. These great musicians' thirst for even more of their teacher's knowledge is a revealing clue to the depth of his study. The most important thing is that perhaps we have studied our chosen instrument all with the same teacher, and that man is Mr. Arnold Jacobs. We've been talking with Mr. Jacobs and firing some questions at him regarding his many, many years of 50-some years of teaching and I guess the equal number of playing or even more of playing perhaps. And it stimulated a lot of thinking in our minds, and several people have spoken to me over the break about questions they'd like to ask. Who would like to start that off? Yes, Steve? Excuse me.
I'm Steve Chenette, University of Toronto. You alluded to this a bit just a few minutes ago, but if you would amplify it a bit, I would find it interesting. I had my first lesson from you 22 years ago, and I don't think there's ever been a year in which I haven't had at least one or two lessons. In the early years, you were extremely informative about the physical aspects of playing. In more recent years, it's almost entirely musical. Now, is this a general change in your teaching, or is it just specific to me?
I would say that the individual is involved in this very, very much. In other words, you go pretty much by what people want to know. And there are people who think along different lines, in a sense, than what I do, and you have to steer a person into, what will I say, a heavy dominance of the musical thought. You were a graduate of the Curtis Institute of Music, if I remember rightly. You had years there, you had years of training in music, and was a very fine musician. In other words, your approach at that time, as I conceived it in those days, was not to enhance your musical thoughts, but to try to give you a better understanding of yourself as to how to cope with your problems, because there was very considerable development and very considerable professionalism in your work. But there was a problem. Do you mind if I discuss your problem? As I recall from 22 years ago, this young man has very unique physical characteristics. In other words, he's of normal height and normal structure, but his somatotype is such that he is huge. He's one great big lung. He is what I would just love to be, in other words, and make use of it. That I had equipment that would only measure 7 liters of air, and he blew that up to 7 liters, and if I hadn't stopped, he would have broken the equipment. There are problems in respiration, and you are a classic example of what happens when a person plays without much air in the lungs. In other words, his normal, what we'll say, breath would have been twice as much as mine. But what was happening, and he was taking in a breath which would allow him to play the same length of phrase as Marcia here, or some of us lesser mortals. He would be able, in other words, if he took a 3-liter inhalation, which would have been fine for me or Marcia, it's a disaster for him, because as you lose air, there are increasing difficulties in a physiological sense of trying to get the air out of the lungs. The air does not come out with the same ease and velocities and work effort. No, the number of muscle fibers that must be contracted near the end of the breath vastly increase. In other words, the motor effort begins to enlarge as you come down in quantities of air. Steve had based his playing on constantly playing in the negative curves of respiration. If we had time, I'd go into the positive and negative curves, but it's easier for me to think along these lines. You were constantly in the negative curves where you would be using far more effort physically than you should. You would be having problems. You also have an enormous tongue. When he puts his tongue out, you will think it's a horse's tongue. It is large. In other words, the ability to reduce the airways, to take a small volume of air and give it the time factor by sending it through a small space rather than a larger volume of air going through a somewhat larger airway. This was in your work. And your conditioning was such that this had all reached the subconscious levels of the brain. I used a twofold approach with you, if you'll remember. We used instrumentation to establish flow, and we used conversation to give understanding. So I did get into more technical approach with you than I very likely would have, or maybe even should have, but to try to give you the reasons why I needed to have you take in more of this gigantic lung capacity. There are norms between two extremes, like a bow, a frog, and tip. Somewhere will be the most desirable section in between two extremes. I had to get them away from the tip too much, the extreme of being out of breath, out of fuel. So much of our early work was, you might say, a guidance into getting you to take in larger lung volumes, because your habits did not include that. As an individual, in running or walking, they included that. Everything was normal, everything was fine. Pick up the trumpet, and the automatic response to the stimuli of playing was to have substitution of small quantities of air under rather intensive pressure, which would involve increasing resistances on the upper end. So I remember we discussed this quite a bit. We used instrumentation. I did everything I could to try to get the brain to focus on the phenomena of song and wind, the ability to use air as a motion phenomena. And my purpose in doing that was simply we had to get you to form a new pattern which was more normal to your physical structures. In my studio, if you remember, we did quite well with this. But on your own, you would revert because of the pressure, I suppose, of professional work. Steve was the first trumpet player with the Minneapolis Symphony Orchestra for a good portion of his career, and a wonderful trumpet player. So what we were up against, again, is the, what will I say, when a man has played for many years, you pick up the horn. As soon as you pick up the horn and it's in position, there are automatic responses. In other words, this provides a powerful stimulus for the conditioned response. And under pressure of stage, it is very difficult not to do what you've always done. I try to get people not to do corrective or remedial work on the stage. I let them do like I do. If you feel bad, lie to the audience. If you're having problems, conceive great sounds, go for it. If you have problems, all right, you're allowed a certain quota. All brass players are allowed a certain quota of notes that we miss or malfunctions, and hopefully we don't overdo it. But if you'll recall, in the early years, this was a mixture. It wasn't a one-way street. In other words, there was considerable work, am I right, on the respiratory activity and trumpet playing, and on increasing your understanding as to the need for you to, in your personal practice, to develop some new habits. You can't break an old habit. This is something that really should be understood. If you conceive of the brain as a unit that has filing cabinets where you put details to be recalled later by opening the cabinet and looking something up, a conditioned response to me is like putting something in the filing cabinet. In the filing cabinets of the brain, you have your automatic responses to stimuli. If somebody's going to honk the horn, you're going to jump out of the way of the car, or any of the automatic responses. Once you've reached that, you can't pull them out of your head and replace it. You simply bypass them. You create new habits to replace old habits. You don't bypass. You can't get them out. So my work with you was based primarily on getting you to motivate the development of new habits.
Is that really all you can remember from one man from 22 years back?
I remember it very well because there was a very considerable challenge, and it is so unique to have a man with superior physical characteristics, and then to have him come into difficulty, and you wonder why, with these advantages, would a person simulate those of us that have smaller lung volumes and many disadvantages. Then I realized that there was a certain aspect in your background and your former teaching and so forth, where they had gone to the school of breath support as being, you might say, support by contraction states in the musculatures, limiting factors that are put on the breathing. There are going to be resultant contractions, always, but if you make them causative, if I blow against my finger, my diaphragm is not contracting vigorously downward, it's letting go, so when the air rushes out, the breathing in muscles are out of the way and the expiratory muscles immediately reduce. With Mr. Jeanette, they would not have done that because there was active conflict between breathing in and blowing out to where a cancellation was going on.
Do you find, you've mentioned weight earlier in the day as being a problem. Do you find conditioning, as in athletic conditioning of a person's torso and so forth, being a problem?
Yeah, weight is a big disadvantage to brass players. In other words, excessive weight, of which I've been very guilty most of my adult life. It's a, you know, what will I say, the feeling of well-being to sit down with your friends and have a beer or 5 or 6 or pound and a half of steak instead of 4 ounces. I mean, this feels great, and of course it's like money in the bank. It keeps drawing interest all the time. And at a certain point, you'll begin to interfere with the physical functions. Our medical men, of course, will be very quick to tell you what it does to the circulatory system, what it does to the health factors in the body. In other words, there are many detrimental factors. But from my concern about seeing people who are overweight playing wind instruments, if they are fully functional, in other words, if they have pulmonary reserves that are large enough that this is not active interfering, I don't make much of a fuss over it. I may make some comment, you know, or something of this type, but I don't make an issue out of it. If they are running short of breath, if they are showing distress signals, from my point of view, then I will definitely ask them to cooperate and start taking some of it off. I don't have to do this very often, but truly, excessive weight is a handicap for a brass player.
How about, though, the athletic training or conditioning?
I think that's great. Athletics, in other words, a healthy body, if you are doing, the thing is to not carry athletic strengths into an art form where there is no way for it to go. In other words, laying on your back supine and putting a set of barbells, or like we did today, have a young lady stand on your tummy, I think this is not the way to go because this brings in isometrics. In other words, muscles always get small when they contract. They shorten. By that I don't mean to get small, it's just simply they shorten, which would be better terminology. When you have isometrics, you look at a weightlifter's arm and he does that, you're seeing bulges all over there, you know, and in order for the abdominal region to become hard, the diaphragm must contract downward. Now the diaphragm is way up here by the xiphoid process, a little bone at the base of the sternum. In other words, there's no diaphragm in the tummy region, it's up here. And it is the sole muscle in opposition to the anterior abdominal wall. If you contract the abdominal muscles, they go in. If you contract the diaphragm, because it goes downward, these go out. If they both contract together, you don't go anywhere, you just get hard. In other words, you run into isometrics. Isometric means cancellation of function. In other words, you can conceive of this as a floor to the respiratory system, and by providing a powerful contraction, you can get the piccolo trumpet or you can get street trumpet, and you can have enormous pressure in the thoracic region, and it will not force the diaphragm down because the pressure under it is greater than the air pressure. So there you have stabilized. This is one of the reasons for the particular school of thought involving this powerful contraction, is the stability that it gives in the lower region, because this is a region of change, not stability. But it can't provide air pressure. Air pressure then, if you use pneumographic readouts, you'll find is being established sternally. It's usually established in regions where they haven't taken much air, so you lose efficiency right there. But you've limited, because all of the muscles of the abdominal region go up this high in the body. They go well up into the rib cage, so this whole region goes out of function as far as change goes. If you don't need much air, like in oboe playing, 3 liters per minute flow rate, 5 liters per minute flow rate, you can get by in long phrases with this. You can't get by in this if you need to have quantities of air and flow. There has to be change. So this particular school of keeping this, if you could say beneficially, as a floor, can be better achieved simply by increasing the pull in, which will increase the intra-abdominal pressure until it matches the needs of the intrathoracic chest pressure. So the air in here then will move out by reduction, like a piston coming up under the lungs. The diaphragm, to do that, has to relax, not contract. In other words, a contracting diaphragm moves from high to low. Well, when you take breath in, the main muscle for lowering air pressure, if you want to look it up in an anatomy text, the chief muscle in the body for achieving low breath pressure is the diaphragm. And yet the tradition of thought is blow from the diaphragm. Well, this is a misnomer. You cannot blow from the diaphragm. This has to do with taking air in, not moving air out. Then you can say, yes, but I mean, well, then if you say, yes, what I mean, then that has changed the meaning of the phrase already. So you blow with expiratory muscles, of which the abdominal muscles are expiratory. If you check it in Gray's Anatomy or but anything that gets smaller has to do with taking air, moving air out. Anything that has to do with enlargement has to do with taking air in. It's that simple.
I'm Richard Watson. I play tuba in the Honolulu Symphony.
Lucky.
And you might think so. As we all know, the music business has become so very, very competitive, and there's great pressure to produce correctly and not make mistakes. How do you develop the necessary security and reliability in your playing without short-circuiting it with the over-analysis that must come about because you're under such pressure?
There are several methods, because if you understand the principle that of what stimulus would be to a reflex response, in other words, the control and accuracy in an embouchure means that there must be a proper signal in the brain. If you're a worried person, the power in your mind, when you are worried, this is a survival phenomena in nature. In other words, a worried human mind becomes wide open for the incoming stimuli to find out what's the danger, what's happening, how can you survive on this planet. So the survival aspect is extremely strong in all of us. And the discipline necessary to overcome this is very important. Now, there are several tools. You can use words, solfege syllables, where you bring in Broca's area of the brain, the part that has to do with speech. And by bringing in words, you have brought in, you might say, accessory aspects within your own brain to focus concentration on stimuli in order to have reflex response. The danger is with the words, you've got a big question, not a statement. Now, the motor nerve that is supposed to signal and have a flow, an electron flow from the brain to tissue, the effectors, at that moment doesn't have it. You may have the lip in perfect shape, but if there's no message going to it, God knows what's going to come out. That's where the inaccuracy comes. You'll find out what were you thinking when you missed a note. You'll find there was a blank. Now, if there could have been the accurate musical symbol in there at that moment as stimuli, you would not have missed that note. Now, there can be other factors, a valve sticking or water key that suddenly leaks and changes the acoustical aspects of the horn. And none of us are perfect, you know. So the point is, as I was saying later, even Bud Herseth, who was probably the most accurate and the best brass player I've ever heard in my life, Bud usually misses a note anywhere from 3 to 4 years. We figure that's his rate. One note in 3 or 4 years might not be perfect. Well, he's slipping. He's 63 now, and I think it goes to about every 2 years. So, but I mean, it's just you week in and week out, everything's there. You never even think of, it's obviously everything's going to be perfect. We know that in advance, and it always is. And I'm not saying this facetiously that this man is most unusual, but it's the brain, not the tissues. And as I say, any person that misses notes a great deal on a brass instrument must recognize what I told today, the difference between an instrument that comes from the factory that's based on, like the piano or the violin or any of the other instruments, on the instrument providing pitch vibration and acoustical amplification, resonance. The brass instrument and the human voice, these are unique. The two factors of motor force and pitch vibration must come from the player according to the acoustical laws of the instrument, and the piece of brass, which has no brains, should amplify. And it will do that if you send the right note. If you send the wrong note, it won't.
A strong similarity or connection between accuracy and tone quality. Would you say that's correct?
Yes. You can play with ugly sounds and be accurate, but they will be thin sounds. They will be sounds of limited dynamic range and so forth, because you're not going to make use of the full acoustical properties of the instrument. But if you listen to, I won't mention the name of a very prominent jazz trumpet player, his sound is not particularly good, but he's a wonderful artist because of his musical message. In other words, this is great music in the idiom that he works with, but the tone production is atrocious. But the message is from him, and he is still getting it very, very successfully. I would prefer to hear function with a little larger embouchure, thicker column of air and so forth, to where the embouchure would be a little freer to response, but still a great player.
I'm Brian Fredrickson, a tubist from the Chicago area. I'm probably one of the more fortunate students of his, because I was going to school on the same floor that his present studio is at on Michigan Avenue in the Fine Arts Building. The one thing is that by being there daily, I was able to see the number of students coming in and out, and the differences, and I'm not necessarily talking on the problems there, but instrumentalists. You would meet persons that would play any instrument, any wind instrument, from parts of the world that, they just fly in from Europe,
That's right.
Scandinavia, Australia, for one lesson with him. It's really quite amazing that probably not too many people really know that much unless you see him there. There are a few instances that you've had some students that have really been quite amazing on there. Now, isn't there one that you've had that is not even a musician? Isn't that, fairly recently?
Oh, you mean Al? Al Picar was just up there. He's a chemist with Eli Lilly Company. He's becoming a beautiful trumpet player. I can't get rid of him.
Was there not one person who, after an article that you had in the Tribune, had called you up about a respiratory problem and was coming in for lessons on breathing?
Oh, I've had all sorts of, well, I've had civilians there. After these articles come out in the paper, I have people that should be in the hospital coming in, and I don't practice medicine. You know what I mean? But I've had people with cancer, lung cancer, come in, and I've had, if they don't have their own physician, I immediately, send them over to competent medical people, because I don't practice medicine. I don't believe in that. But I've had people come in to see me for the darndest things. You have no idea what some of them are. But they are looking for help. And very frequently, if there's an indication that you can give them some help, they'll be at your door. And some of my musicians have been in the same category, and people with very serious problems. And sometimes, if it's a musical problem, I go into it. If it's a problem of physical function, I definitely am involved with it. But if it's a medical problem, then we have competent physicians that take over. Every time there's an article, there's one in this week's Chicago Reader in Chicago. It was about a 4-page article about me with a nice picture on the front page. And I can well imagine what's going to happen when I go back to Chicago. It came out on Thursday night, and late Thursday night around midnight, I had a phone call. There was a singer from the Metropolitan Opera was in town, and he read that, And he immediately called me. He just had to get together with me. Well, I couldn't take him until Saturday, and so I'd had him come in, and we worked, and we had a very successful lesson. But after reading that article, I've had string players. You mentioned the cello player. I've had violinists come in. I was able to help one with a tremolo because he had arthritis, and he was having terrible problems in the forearm. And so we started focusing this function based on the string and the hair of the bow where it functions. There again, we go to the product. What are you trying to accomplish? As he started working in this end, there was letting go of the muscles here. And pretty soon he was functioning very nicely with the fingers and the bow and without the tremendous contractions in the forearm, you know. So this is sort of a form of physiotherapy, and it can be applied in many, many different dimensions. And with music, I apply it the way I perceive it, you know, with the individual. After all, when you take whether it's trumpet or trombone or tuba, what does it take to vibrate a pair of chops? You don't have to have athletic strengths to vibrate the lip. You see what I mean? And yet the horn responds to the vibration of the lip on certain frequencies. It doesn't have to be right, you know, but it can still sound awfully good. So in, you know, simplifying this whole subject, my teaching, again, is to come down in the states of complexity to find the functions and the simplicity where they belong. You play with the use of air, of course. You play with the lip as a vibrating source. You play with the instrument based on the phenomena of music. But above everything else, you have to think within your art form.
My name is Bob Caron from Los Angeles, and a few moments ago you talked about solfege. And I believe you studied with Renee Longy a long while back, and I studied with her also. She was one of the motivating forces that brought me to you. And I wonder if you could talk about solfege a little bit and how it's used for brass instruments.
Well, I think solfege is one of the most important subjects that I know of. Many years ago, when I first joined the faculty of Northwestern University, about 25 years ago, I brought up the subject of the desirability of solfege in their teaching, and they looked at me like I'd told a dirty joke on Sunday in church, and it was received terribly. I don't know why. To this day, I don't understand why they did not see any value in solfege. But solfeggio is the training of the mind so that when you see an ink spot on a page, it becomes a stimuli for what it represents as sound in the brain. If you look at words, words have meanings. If you look at the word stop, S-T-O-P, those are just ink spots. That has a meaning. Red, R-E-D, a color. All you see are those ink spots. It means something. You take a man in electronics and you give him a symbol in electronics, and he immediately is thinking of Ohm's law, the resistance, or this or that, whatever in the discipline that it represents. Ink spot means something. What does it mean to a musician? Now, if ink spots on a piano, unfortunately, could mean you touch this key. I want to touch an A. So you hit the A. You can play that A without hearing it. In other words, it'll give you the answer. You can do it as a question, and it'll give you an answer. A brass instrument, the laws of acoustics are such that it should be a statement. Now, you develop the ability to have a statement by the study of solfege. Do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, si, do, so, mi, do, fa, la, do, fa, whatever it's going to be, but you have always the ability to see ink spots which convert into sound. They become stimulus for what they represent, just like the language aspect would. This is our language of sound. Now, if there is such a thing as a shortcut in music, in playing a brass instrument, I would say this would be it. There is no such thing. There are ways of maximal efficiency. But this is one of the ways to maximal efficiency, is to have solfeggio. Herseth is a master of it. Dale Clevenger, our first horn, is marvelous in solfege. I had to have it required for 3 years at the Curtis Institute. I took it for 6.5 years. Lange's, when she was married, the married name was Mikhail, and married a Nobel player, and so I knew her as Madame Mikhail. But I asked to be in her class, And it was one of the most valuable experiences. There are two experiences I remember at the Curtis Institute that were just magnificent for me. The 6.5 years of solfeggio with Madame McHale and 3 years of phrasing with Marcel Tabito, the first oboe player of the Philadelphia Orchestra. I was in this phrasing class, again by request, and I took it for as long as they would tolerate having me in there. And being a tuba player, I was very much interested in phrasing, and so I was taught phrasing along with his oboe students and the others, and I felt it was of an enormous value to me. Solfege is something that I wished any trumpet player having difficulty with accuracy, or any tuba player with accuracy, I wish they would master solfege by taking 20 minutes a day and a pitch source and start from scratch with the worst voice in the world. If there's changes in range, drop octaves or whatever, get to where it suits you, but nevertheless, a consistent daily dose of solfege is just magnificent for any of us. I still do it to this day.
I have one short question. I've been associated with many singers in my life. I'm married to one, and I'm often asked, what are the differences in breathing between playing and singing? I never can come up with a good answer because they all seem to have different approaches than you do, than we try to do. Could you just spend a couple of minutes or a minute on that?
Of course. You know, singing takes very little air. My, oh my, oh my. If you put your hand up there and try to sing and don't even feel warm air on your hands, to minimize it as much as possible, you'll find what you need in singing. Contrast this to what you do with your instrument, and you have basic answer right there. Your inhalation can be quite similar, except they can get by with more limited inhalation than you can. The flow rate, when you hook a face mask up to a singer and put them on spirometric equipment and record the act of singing, the flow rate is extremely low. The flow rate on your instrument is quite high. So you have a great difference when you use the air going that way. You don't have such a great difference when you have it going this way. Now, it depends. Now, is your wife tall?
No, she's about 5'6".
All right. Very frequently in the girls, they're given long phrases. The higher voices don't take as much air in terms of lung volumes as maybe a bass singer would, but there's still considerable overtime period. But if they have to go 30 seconds on a single phrase, they better take more than a shallow breath. In other words, there should be quantitative breaths. Now, with this young man from the Met that I worked with, there was a strong indication of regional breathing. In other words, maybe a 60% inhalation, 50% inhalation. This was more than adequate. This is a fine singer. He's with the Met now. He used to sing with the opera in Frankfurt when Schulte was the conductor there. And this is a fine artist we're talking about, but he was beginning to experience difficulties, and there was little strains coming in. I just had to touch him, and I knew what it was immediately. But there is a loss of vital capacity with age. In other words, what you have when you're 20 is not what you have when you're 50. And he was 55 years old. I call him young because it's all relative. And anyway, this man was expanding to breathe instead of breathing to expand. He was going through the mechanics, but he was not getting the lung volumes. So I had him inhale specific volumes of air so we knew what he was doing in terms of quantity. Almost immediately there was improvement to where he was quite happy. He left very happy. But he had considerably increased lung volumes by the time he left the studio. He had been suffering a deterioration vocally because the amount of muscle motion was producing less of a product. This is what happens through the pollutants in the air, through the loss of elasticity of tissue, through the aging process. There are predictable losses, and under environmental situations like New York and Chicago, it can be increased even more so. So simply by taking more generalized inhalations rather than regional, there immediately was improvement because there was increased quantity of fuel to work with.
I'm John Kreider. I'm the horn instructor at James Madison University in Virginia. I had my first lesson about 10 years ago, and I think when I came in for the first lesson, I freely admit I was into the paralysis by analysis syndrome. And Toward the end of the lesson, I believe you mentioned to me that you knew how I was going to play before I ever did play, and that you can generally do this. And I just wondered how you do that.
Your background, where you're coming from. I'm often proven wrong, but if you come from the educational background, especially 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago, there are concepts that were running through our institutions, and they were producing a certain type of product, that's all. In other words, I figured based on, with many students, and I question them where they're coming from, what their background is, I can make an estimate as to what I will hear, and then I was doing the research program. Of course, that's why I was so interested in it at that time. But generally, it was right. Now, today, I get surprised more and more because there's greater excellence coming around, you know, where fewer people are being, what will I say, channeled into minimal functions and lesser functions than they're capable of. Just like with Mr. Chenette, the potential of having over 7 liters of lung capacity, if used properly, gives a tremendous advantage. If used improperly, is worse than having 5 liter. In other words, if you have a small lung capacity, you just cannot function for phrase without taking a large breath. You just are not going to get anywhere. But a large man can function with shallow breath because he's still going to have the quantity, but the physiological processes of getting these out in his lungs are going to work against him, not for him, which will create handicaps.
It makes me feel a lot better.
My name's Marcia Kaufman, and I used to be principal trumpet in Stockholm and also in the Munich Philharmonic Orchestras. Now I'm freelancing in Chicago, and I had an opportunity to take some lessons with Mr. Jacob this past year. And I was at his master class last summer at Northwestern, and he gave us some specific exercises for increasing our lung capacity. And I wish you could elaborate on those now.
It's difficult to do under these conditions, you know, because I'm not free to walk around and do the things that you would do, you know, or involving physical exercise. But what they usually amount to would be to go into the psychology of respiration. Nobody can increase your lung capacity beyond what nature intended. But we try to bring you up to what your potential is. Marcia is a marvelous trumpet player and a wonderful piccolo trumpet player. And besides being a beautiful woman, she's a beautiful player. And all I try to do with somebody like this is get your potentials working for you. In other words, if there is a minimizing process that's put in somewhere based on concept, we try to alter that a bit in your favor. Now, the exercises are to be done away from music, to establish normalcy as a person. And we do this by teaching inhalation and exhalation. There are simple studies. You can take anybody and have them blow their breath out until they're as empty as they can achieve. In other words, and then wait with empty lungs until a need for respiration occurs. In other words, when they're turning blue and beginning to suffer, then you take a huge yawn. That breath, after having denied yourself of respiration for 20, 30 seconds, is going to be enormous compared to your musical breath. If you think instrument, you won't do it. But by creating a need for oxygen, a debt, you might say, then the conditions of the enormous yawn, which immediately brings you into a different mental state, you will find then what you could take under the abnormal conditions that I'm describing. Then you know, all right, there is a potential for this. And then you can begin to work. You can make simple bags out of paper, plastic, and so forth, and blow them up like a balloon. You want something without resistance, but will trap your air. And then you can pour water in the bag and find out what it measures and then use air instead. They're not exact measurements, but you're going to have approximations develop. And with a young lady like yourself, you figure you're going to start at 3 or 4 liters, maybe a 4-liter bag, a 5-liter bag. You don't have to fill it up all the way. But there should be a method of taking bowing and going from frog to tip. If you think of your air, like you would the movement of bow, the ability, the fuel supply of playing, then you have the way of doing it. By taking a bag, you're rebreathing your own air, which means you can go for 10 or 15 seconds without hyperventilation. You would then have hypoventilation. If you go too long, you'd be dead. But hopefully you won't exceed 15 or 20 seconds. It's like holding your breath for 15 or 20 seconds. You introduce tubing into the mouth. Take a piece of tube 3 inches long and 3/4 of an inch in diameter and practice yawning through it. Find out how freely you can fill the lungs, how weak you can be, because the effort to take negative air pressure in is measured in very, very low pressures. In other words, if you take your arm and do this, the energy of using your arm this way should be translated into the abdominal functions, and don't increase it beyond that, and still go to full and empty lungs. There'll be slight differences. Don't hold me to the exact innervation amount, but nevertheless, you learn to take large volume movements of air as a civilian and spend time where this becomes a skill. Then you take some of these large breaths and you simply play on the mouthpiece without the trumpet. And even there, waste the breath. Don't try to save it. It's free. It don't cost anything. But you make good music with it. And then when you replace it, you use sense of sight, a mirror. And you find, do you look like this? When I have my male students come in, usually they're using only abdominal breathing. So I tell them, oh, you've got to look like Dolly Parton. In other words, I need the upper chest as well. There is no such thing as a complete breath without the thoracic region being involved. This singer that came to me the other day says, why, you're moving your shoulders. Of course, you can't take a full breath without moving your shoulders. It doesn't exist. In nature, in a sense, I'm talking about true capacity breath. I'm not saying it's desirable to do this when you're playing your instrument, but if you want to find the follow-through phenomena, then you must fill and empty your lungs. You don't worry about whether you move your shoulders or whether you do this or that. You take as much air as you can and you blow air out. The physical skill develops. You don't start with skill. You must allow crudities at the first stage. And you practice increasing ease in the movements of large volumes of air. Then you practice the same ease in taking it in after playing a phrase on your instrument, so that it's a one-way street. The efforts are outward, not inward. Whatever it is. Always in is easy. Out will be where the challenge of the resistances of function will be. And can I go on with this? There's a study called neural inhibition. In other words, in a neurological sense, when you have a positive direction of motion in your musculatures in any one direction, if you suddenly reverse, you will have innervation in the reversal muscle. If you're going in extension fast and you have to go into flexion, you will have innervation of the extensors of the arm, but when you reverse, you will have innervation of the muscles that will flex the arm. But you also have de-innervation of even muscle tone in the extensor. In other words, if you don't surprise yourself, if you're blowing out and then you have to breathe in, you can take a tremendous breath. If you're still blowing out and you breathe in, you will have a gasp, but you will not have much air. But if you reverse the priority, when you breathe in, you are not blowing. You are sucking air up here, not working muscles down here. In other words, by taking air in here, the brain will immediately deactivate the antagonisms. They disappear so fast. Believe me, it cannot be learned readily while you're playing your instrument. Should be learned away from your instrument and then transferred back, whether it's a student or the player.
I'm Dick Erb from the New Orleans Philharmonic. I play bass trombone there, and I've had the pleasure of studying with Mr. Jacobs for a long time, many years, since 1966, in small doses spread over that time. And there's something that I'm very curious about, which is it's apparent that you have a very organized and structured knowledge of behavioral and learning psychology. Apart from anatomy and physiology, this is a totally different discipline. And I've always been very curious about where that came from and where you gathered that particular part of all the things that you know. And I'd like to know a little about that.
Most of it is from just observation and common sense. Everybody's a psychologist, whether you use terminology, but to live on this planet, work with people, you're all psychologists. And Sheldon here, of course, is a doctorate in psychology. I don't have a degree in psychology, but he's still learning from me.
Now he wants to teach you something.
Right, right.
Tomorrow we're going to talk a little bit about this, but what Arnold has done really is he has, based on the information that he had from his students, intuited the laws that we have come to understand through intuition and at least 60 years of research. And I teach learning theory at a graduate level, and he's on the money.
This came about, as I say, through curiosity and through putting many factors together. In other words, I had myself as an example, a fairly trouble-free player. I had people with problems. I have people in other fields that I watch for. I have studied the structures. I have studied a good deal about the brain. I follow the research that's going on in various disciplines. I'm an avid reader of that. I have talked to many expert people within these fields. And so this is a culmination of, what you might say was many years of investigation. And again, I want to stress that the answers are all in simplicity, not complexity. The study of what we are has become so complex. In other words, what I thought was complex back in 1944 and then 45 and 46 doesn't even approach the true complexity of what we are. I would have to live many lifetimes, I think, to be able to get a really comprehensive knowledge of what we're there. But every time you have a piece of knowledge come in on this, there's 4 doors that have to be opened on the other side. Then you get those 4, and there's 4 for each door on the other side. It's just a constant expanding affair. So I've learned to recognize that whoever designed us, what we are in a religious or whatever sense we are, we have magnificent brains, of which none of us really can truly comprehend the magnificence of it. I don't think any of us even begin to use our brains with real efficiency. In other words, training would have to start from birth and go, and the understanding of what to train and everything else is not there yet. If I had the knowledge 30 years ago that I have today, I'm sure I'd be very far along compared to what I am today, and I've done pretty well with what I have. But what I'm trying to indicate to you is the answers really lie in the studies of motivation, the study of what people are like, what we're doing, you know, and logical thought and how to use our brains intelligently and not really wasting our time in the sense of the yoga. I admire yoga. I admire many of the disciplines for mind control over the body. I think there's great use for some of this. But my goodness, why spend hours and hours learning to control peristalsis? You've got magnificent controls for peristalsis now, so you can put this intelligence into other aspects. Sure, you can lower blood pressure by biofeedback, by concentrating along certain lines of thought, so the mood changes, that the brain doesn't race, and it can then relax and focus in on something simple where the body will tend to relax and the blood pressure will go down. But again, in other words, if you're happy and if you have wonderful thoughts and they're calm, you're going to have it anyway, unless you're a salt freak or something like that, you know, or certain physical abnormalities come in. But what I'm trying to say is to use the brain efficiently. There's more knowledge today than there's ever been on this subject. The one thing I would say, and from my own limited knowledge, is simply don't waste it on trying to control something you can't control, like an embouchure. When you've controlled music, you've controlled embouchure. You don't control meat to control sound. You control sound to control meat. It's just simply a reversal of that. It could be checked out. It's not just my statement.
I'm Mike Sanders, and I play tuba in the San Antonio Symphony. And I think one wonderful thing about studying with Mr. Jacobs has been the images that he can conjure up for us. Like he was saying, he would tell a trumpet player to play it just like Bud Herseth. And you gave me an image once without really realizing it. And this goes back to when you lived on Normal Street. And I was waiting upstairs in your living room, and you were teaching a lesson down below. And I was listening. And it's a sound I'll never forget because I could feel the floor under me resonating. And you were working on, I guess, orchestral passages with someone. And you started playing the tuba part from Siegfried's Funeral Music, starting on the low G, the long extended phrases that are down there. And it was such a wonderful resonant sound, and it was so obviously you and your personality coming through even the floor. And I've never, I've never forgotten that. And it's a concept that I've kept with me.
Thank you.
I think that's true of many of us. I mentioned the recordings, and several other people did earlier in the day, even your voice on the telephone.
But isn't that a factor, though, that a musician will learn so much by hearing others and by conceiving? The only warning I give is don't listen so much to yourself. Play for somebody else, and then listen to playbacks, or recognize you're still hear yourself, but with a low percentage of your concentration. So the massive concentration, like I'm doing with you people today, is communicating. I can hear myself, but I'm not concentrating on what I sound like. I'm concentrating on very complex thoughts because you're asking very complex questions. And if I didn't know my subject well, I would be in trouble up here. But fortunately, I do know it well. So I have no time to concentrate on laryngeal and pharyngeal and lingual, all the activities of muscles and respiration. I have to concentrate on messages. And of course, this is pretty much what happens with the instrument. You must concentrate always on talking to your audience instead of with vocal language, speech language. You do it with the musical language of your instrument. But you have to have a message for somebody else. The worst thing is to be asking questions at the moment you should be issuing statements. That's important.
You've told us about the reduction in lung volume that occurs with age, and you spoke about this singer. Will you relate this to why it seems that brass players are on their way out in the 50s, in their 50s?
This would be a question asked by a psychologist because it's in their department. The aging process not only includes a physical deterioration, lessening of some of our potentials, which a person in their 50s are still very viable, functional people, but there's an attitude change where enthusiasm tends to lessen. There's a change very much in perspective. When you're young, I have a young tuba player substituting for me with the Chicago Symphony. He can't wait to go on the stage and demonstrate what he can do with difficult music. There's no worry about that. It may go wrong, but here's Beadlo coming up. I'll play Beadlo. Here's something that's coming. I'll do this. And he'll do it, and he'll do it beautifully. I was this way. As you grow older, there's a caution that starts to come in, and you'll begin to say, now, what if? What if this goes wrong? God, I missed that note 10 years ago, and it's coming up now. Gee, I hope I don't miss it today. The first thing, you're beginning to think negatively instead of positively. This is what I'm talking about. In other words, if you fail to provide the stimulus in the brain, you will not have the physical response. If you've played perfectly all your life, the filing cabinets will have automatic responses that are really quite good. But if you want to take charge, you must sing to your audience at whatever it's going to be. The deterioration that you asked about is an attitude change that comes with the aging process. And of course, there are physical deteriorations as well.
Follow it up. It's my understanding, you'll correct me, that with the loss of air volumes, people start to do things to correct for the loss of air volumes, and they screw up their playing entirely.
Yes, this is true. With the reduction in lung volumes, with the air volumes, there will be automatic activities of reduced space in the larynx, in the pharynx. The tongue will take, in other words, if you want to blow, we'll say for 20 seconds, and you take a certain volume of air, if you take a very small straw, you can force air through for maybe 20 seconds. But if you take exactly the same intake of air and you take a larger straw, you will only be able to move it maybe for half that time. If you take a still larger straw, the same volume taken in will go for still less time. Now, if you don't take in sufficient volumes of air, there will be reductions to where you can complete phrases that you would have completed as a younger person, but it will be done with reduced airways. If it reduces beyond a certain point, the volume of air reaching the lip becomes too small, and the lip will become very difficult for it to respond at all. If you just take your hand and you go against it with a sibilant S, you will feel a large pressure of air behind the tongue, but very little air at the lip, at the hand. If you go and just blow on it, you'll feel a tremendous increase in pressure of air against your hand. The quantities in motion are vast compared to well, the ability to have the sibilant is not only there at the front of the tongue, it can be through closure in the laryngeal arrangement with the epiglottis, having it come up onto there, expansion of the musculatures of the tongue, closing off of airway to where you actually starve the embouchure for air volume. You can have it for air pressure. There will be oodles of pressure, but the volume of air is too small to operate the embouchure. If you go beyond a critical point, the lip will start to fail. In other words, it will start to be very unresponsive. Up to a certain point, there's no harm in the reduction. Past a certain point, it's a disaster. Now, with these people who are suffering lung volumes, this works automatically. Now, there's a cycling that starts. With this increasing sense of difficulty in tone production, the brain stops being positive, starts to say, well, what's wrong? This feels terrible. You can't get the sensations in the intraoral cavity or pharyngeal. You get it from the lip. You'll get from the lip a feeling of lack of response, of increasing resistance, that it doesn't want to respond. What's wrong? You start analyzing it. The first thing, the signal that should be going down the 7th cranial nerve to provide stimuli for the motor reflexes of the embouchure based on conditioning is not taking place. There's a big question instead of a statement. These people very quickly leave the business.
Mr. Jacobs, unfortunately, I'm getting signals from elsewhere that we're just about out of time. And again, this has been a fascinating day, and I think this has been the best lesson I've ever had, and I think
thank you very much. I enjoyed talking to you all, and I hope that if you want to continue this, you'll call me and ask me to clarify some of these points, because I know some of them are difficult to comprehend if you're not used to thinking along these lines.
Bravo.